Good evening. I'm excited about some Hosea. I liked Isaiah. It was just too much. It's just too much I had to skip too much stuff in Isaiah. But in Hosea, we get all the good stuff of Hosea and get to look at that. So I'm looking forward to this study together. Let's start out. Let's do something a little different. Let's start out just reading the first few verses of Hosea chapter 1 and just set this tone of this book. It says, "The word of the Lord that came to Hosea the son of Beeri in the days of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah, and in the days of Jeroboam the son of Joash, king of Israel. When the Lord first spoke through Hosea, the Lord said to Hosea, 'Go take yourself a wife of whoredom, and have children of whoredom. For the land commits great whoredom by forsaking the Lord.' So he went and took Gomer, the daughter of Diblaim, and she conceived and bore him a son." So just set the stage for this book. What happens at the very beginning helps us understand essentially the message of the book and where this whole book is going. God has called this man named Hosea to be a prophet of his at much the same time as Isaiah, the book we just studied. It's a time of prosperity, a time when Israel and Judah are separated. But Israel is serving under Jeroboam II, and God saves the northern kingdoms, and he assists them, makes them into this great nation, it seems like. And then the southern nation had 3 out of 4 really good kings. Remember, Ahaz was this bad king who offered sacrifices on the sun. But what it tells us at the very beginning of this book is that God, at the very beginning of Hosea's ministry, tells Hosea as a young man, "I want you to go and marry a wife who is a wife of whoredom, a woman who is in the family of prostitution, that this is what she knows, this is her life, this is what she's involved in and what her friends, her family, her relatives are involved in. Maybe she's pure at this point whenever he marries her, but this is what her likelihood is. This is what her common work would be, that she would grow up and be a prostitute." And Hosea is called to marry this woman. So just imagine from the very beginning of your call as a prophet being told, "All right, I want you to go marry one of those women who are in wherever, downtown Mobile." I don't even know if we have any prostitutes in downtown Mobile. Go marry one of those women, and she's going to be your wife. And the reason is the land commits great whoredom by forsaking the Lord. How many of us are excited about that? That doesn't sound good at all, right? I mean, this is not why we marry somebody, so that they can go out and betray us and commit adultery against us. That just sounds horrible. But this is the state of Israel. It gives the condition of Israel in the calling of Isaiah, that they are an evil and adulterous people who commits whoredom by going after all of these idols and idolatry. And so the book of Hosea tells us the condition of the people very plainly in an image from the very beginning that this prophet lives out. God has a number of signs that he gives to his people, Israel. In Ezekiel, it's just loaded with signs. We've seen them in Jeremiah. We see them in Isaiah, that he walks around naked for like 3 years. Okay, there's a number of signs that are really hard to digest that these men would have to perform. But man, can you imagine this sign? That you have now bound yourself to a woman who is going to commit adultery against you. Well, as we study this book, I think what God wants us to do is to see his perspective through the eyes of Hosea. A man who has married someone, who has committed his life to someone, who has decided to love her and to provide for her and to be faithful to her, and yet she continually goes against him and rebels against him and has sex with other men. This is the way that God wants us to look at his perspective as he looks at Israel and he sees who they are and what they are doing. The rest of chapter 1 Hosea has children, Hosea and Gomer. He marries a woman named Gomer, and they have children together, and God starts naming their children. And all of his children are going to be assigned. Not only is his wife going to be assigned, but all their children are going to be assigned. The first child he names Jezreel, because he's going to punish the house of Jehu for the blood that was spilled in Jezreel. Now, Jehu was a king who the current king Jeroboam has descended from, who wiped out Ahab's house. I mean, he did great. He was killing everybody for the evil of Ahab, and he's killing all the priests of Baal, but he ends up killing the friends of Ahab. He ends up killing the chiefs under Ahab. He ends up killing everybody. He's just a murderer. He's this crazy conqueror who kills everybody. And so God says in this first child, his name will be Jezreel, and Jezreel means God will scatter, because God is going to punish Israel for the sins of Jehu. Now, God will scatter is the name of the plains of Jezreel when all of these events happened under Jehu. But that could kind of have a positive connotation or a negative connotation. I mean, God will scatter. Will he scatter seed? Is everything's going to be great? Or is he going to scatter his people? Well, in this case, it seems as though it's much more of a judgment, that God is going to scatter the house of Jehu. Then he names the second child, No Mercy. Call her name No Mercy, because I will have no more mercy on the house of Israel to forgive them at all, verse 6. Can you imagine the child's name is No Mercy? Okay, hey, No Mercy, come over here. Wow, your kid's name is No Mercy, man. It's a girl. She's going to be relentless, right? She's not going to be merciful at all. And Hosea's like, no. This means God's not going to forgive Israel for their sins. God's not going to show any mercy to Israel for their sins. This is the sign of the second child that's born to Hosea and Gomer. And then listen to the third child. As soon as the second child is weaned, Gomer's going to conceive and have another child, and it's going to be a son, and the Lord will call his name, Not My People. Imagine having a child called Not My People. Not mine. Hey, not mine. Come on in here, What does this say about whose son not mine really is? I mean, you tell your friend, my children are Jezreel, No Mercy, and not mine. Oh, well, I think I know where that child came from. All right. So the picture is the unfaithfulness of Israel is going to be judged. I mean, the statement, not my people, isn't just kind of this funny thing, but that would be connected to the promises that were made to Abraham. Remember, Abraham was promised, if he would keep that covenant and be circumcised, we just read this last week, that God would be his people's God, like all his offspring. God would be their God, and they would be his people. And God just kind of reverses that promise and says, not my people. I'm not going to show them mercy anymore. I'm going to scatter them. Uh-oh. This is not good. The reversal of the promises, that's a big deal. And we've been studying through all the Old Testament, seeing how those promises need to come true. God's going to fulfill them. God's going to bring them about. And then we see, ain't happening. Not my people. I'm done with them. No mercy is going to be given to them. But look at verse 10. He says, yet the number of the children of Israel shall be like the sand of the sea, which cannot be measured or numbered. And in the place where it was said to them, you are not my people, it shall be said to them, children of the living God. And the children of Judah and the children of Israel shall be gathered together, not scattered, gathered together, and they shall appoint for themselves one head, and they shall go up from the land, for great shall be the day of Jezreel. Say to your brothers, you are my people, and to your sisters, you have received mercy. Notice the yet. Even though all this judgment's about to come upon this people, God has decided he will fulfill the promises that he's made to Abraham. They will be as numerous as the sand on the seashore, which cannot be measured and numbered. They will be called God's children. They will be gathered together. Remember, they're a divided nation. Judah and Israel gathered together under one head, and they will receive mercy, and they will be called God's people. So in this very first chapter, into chapter 2, the very first statement, setting up the whole scene, we kind of see this. The current condition is worthy of judgment, but there's this future hope that God wants to give to his people. Even though they have sinned and rebelled against him, he's going to fulfill his promises one way or another. Now remember, this is a very early prophet. So all the people of Israel are enjoying the blessings, and maybe they've got some hope that God is still with them and still going to provide for them. And these prophecies of judgment, maybe they're just falling on deaf ears, oh well. But now there's even mixed in there a prophecy about hope. God is condemning them and judging them, but he's mixing in words of hope. You continue in chapter 2 and you see really this whole, it's kind of continuing this picture of Hosea and his wife and the children. The very first, in verse 2 it says, "Plead with your mother, plead, for she is not my wife, and I am not her husband, that she put away her whoring from her face and her adultery from between her breasts, lest I strip her naked, and make her as in the day she was born, and make her like a wilderness, and make her like a parched land, and kill her with thirst." Notice how it kind of mixes in these imageries together, saying, plead with your mother, children, go talk to Gomer, and tell her to stop being, a prostitute, and giving herself to everybody, so that I don't have to bring her to shame. Really, you go through chapter 2 and chapter 3, this image is really being pressed on in this whole section. He tries to convince Homer tries to convince Gomer to stop being the prostitute, to stop pursuing her lovers. And at the same time, we see God is trying to convince Israel, stop pursuing idols. Stop going after the nations. Stop going after what all the rest of the world is doing. And thinking that in them you will find what you're looking for. You're not. Verse 5, "For their mother has played the whore. She who conceived them has acted shamefully. For she said, I will go after my lovers, who give me my bread and my water, my wool and my flax, my oil and my drink." Notice how she thinks, I'm going to go after them and they're going to give me everything. All of my blessings have been coming from them all along. And so I'm going to go after them because I find the satisfaction comes from them. And God says, I'm going to take away your blessings. It turns out, verse 8, she did not know that it was I who gave her the grain, the wine, the oil, and who lavished on her silver and gold, which they used for Baal. He says, I'm the one who gave her all those things. Verse 9, "Therefore I will take back my grain in its time, and my wine in its season, and I will take away my wool and my flax, which were to cover her nakedness. Now I will uncover her lewdness in the sight of her lovers, and no one shall rescue her out of my hand." God says that Israel has rebelled against him, going after all these other places, thinking that in them they're finding all these blessings, when in fact it was God who provided those things. And God has decided, I'm going to take all those things away from her now, and I'm going to help her understand that she is nothing without me. And all those lovers that she thinks are filling her and giving her everything, they're going to abandon her. They're not going to rescue her. They're not going to help her. They can't. And so God leaves her desolate, leaves Israel desolate in this exile. And this is exactly what I think Gomer is happening to Gomer through Hosea. And notice, though, verse 14, he makes this decision, I'm not going to leave her completely desolate. He removes all those blessings from her, leaves her naked, leaves her ashamed, lets her feel the pain and the suffering of rebelling against God. And then he says in verse 14, "Behold, I will allure her and bring her into the wilderness and speak tenderly to her. And there I will give her her vineyards and make the valley of Achor a door of hope." Now, valley of Achor is touching back to when Achan sinned by taking things from Jericho, if you remember back in the book of Joshua, and was judged. The valley of Achor would be a valley of judgment because Achan was stoned there. But instead of the valley of judgment, it will be a door of hope. God wants to speak tenderly to his people again. Even though he makes them desolate, even though he brings all this judgment, he has plans to allure her. You see this this lover kind of language. He's not going to force her. He's going to draw her to himself by showing tremendous love and compassion and care for her. And then as you continue, you look at verse 16. It says, "In that day, declares the Lord, you will call me my husband, and no longer will you call me my Baal." Now, my Baal means my master, my Lord. That's what Baal is. So now there's a turnaround in the situation that now God is alluring her, and now she is coming to him not thinking, oh, he's this master that I got to do what he says and I can't stand it, but thinking, I love him. You know, he's my husband. He's so loving and compassionate and merciful. Verse 19, it says, "And I will betroth you to me forever. I will betroth you to me in righteousness and in justice and in steadfast love and in mercy. I will betroth you to me in faithfulness, and you shall know the Lord." There's this picture of betrothal, joining together, becoming the husband of God. Then chapter 3 tells us the Hosea part of the story. Throughout chapter 2, we kind of get the picture that this is kind of Hosea and God, and then verse 14, it's like God talking about Israel, how he's going to bring Israel back, and maybe how Hosea is going to bring Gomer back. But chapter 3, verse 1, the Lord commands him to go to Gomer, who has committed adultery, and bring her back to you. Pay for her. It turns out Gomer has, because she's now desolate, been put up on the auction block to be sold into slavery. And Hosea is commanded, I want you to go and I want you to buy Gomer back, and I want you to take her with you, and I want you to be her husband again. Verse 3, "I said to her, you must dwell as mine for many days. You shall not play the whore or belong to another man. So will I also be to you." Here's Hosea. I keep wanting to say Homer. Here's Hosea talking to Gomer and saying, you're going to come and live with me and be faithful. And if you will do that, you will be completely restored to me as my wife. And I will be your husband. And I will be as faithful to you as I've always been. And I will show you the love that I've always showed you. Verse 4 says, "The children of Israel shall dwell many days without king or prince, without sacrifice or pillar, without ephod or household gods. Afterward, the children of Israel shall return and seek the Lord their God and David their king. And they shall come in the fear of the Lord and to his goodness in the latter days." God foretells after the exile, they're not going to have a king. They're not going to have princes. They're not going to be set up again. And they're going to suffer without that and be desolate for many days. But then they will be allowed to return to seek me and to seek David. And they will fear me and they will find goodness in the relationship that they're able to have with me. Now, I went through detail in a lot of this first 3 chapters because it's just so amazing how God portrays this relationship between the prophet and the prostitute as being God and Israel, and how this perfectly sums up all of the sin and rebellion of Israel against God and God's response. Yes, he will send them into exile. And he will punish them for many days. He will let them go desolate and let them see how good they had it under God's loving care. But he will allure them and bring them back and show them that steadfast love. And they will be his people and he will be their God. Then we transition into the next section of the book. In chapter 4, it starts off, "Hear the word of the Lord, O children of Israel." And so we now hear the word of the Lord given to the children of Israel. And this section lasts from chapter 4 all the way to chapter 10. And what this section is going to be consisting of is all the different ways that Israel has sinned against God and helping them understand how they are Gomer, how they have done the very things that Gomer has done to Hosea, so that they can grasp all of these concepts. In the very first verse, it says, "For the Lord has a controversy with the inhabitants of the land. There is no faithfulness or steadfast love, and no knowledge of God in the land." You see, the situation is very similar to what Isaiah said. Nobody knows the Lord. There's no steadfast love. There's no faithfulness. There's nobody in the land who knows God and who wants to do what God has called them to do. And because of that, as you continue, you see God is accusing the priests and the prophets. Because the people are destroyed for lack of knowledge, that means the priests and the prophets have not done their job correctly. But the people are still guilty. It says in verse 10, they shall eat but not be satisfied. They shall play the whore but not multiply, because they have forsaken the Lord, to cherish whoredom, wine, and new wine, which takes away the understanding. He condemns the priests, he condemns the prophets, but he also condemns the people because they are just fully involved in this idolatry. They are involved in sexual immorality. They're involved in drunkenness, and they are not involved in understanding God's will. And he says in all of this, they're not going to be satisfied. And so what God is going to do is, in chapter 5, we see he's going to wound them. Verse 13, when Ephraim saw his sickness and Judah his wound, then Ephraim went to Assyria and sent to the great king, but he was not able to cure you or heal your wound. So he says Ephraim and Judah are going to suffer. They're going to be wounded, and they're going to go out looking for someone to help them with their wound, and they're not going to find anybody. And God says in verse 15, I'm going to return to my place until they acknowledge their guilt and seek my face. And in their distress, whenever they earnestly seek me, then I might turn to them. But chapter 6 says, verse 1, come, let us return to the Lord, for he has torn us, that he may heal us. He has struck us down, and he will bind us up. After 2 days, he will revive us. On the third day, he will raise us up, that we may live before him. Let us know. Let us press on to know the Lord. His going out is sure as the dawn. He will come to us as the showers, as the spring rains that water the earth. It seems as though in chapter 6, verse 1 through 3, the people do turn to the Lord. Oh, well, God was waiting for them to do that, and now they've done it. Okay, great. They've returned to the Lord. There's healing. Everything will be great. Well, look at verse 4. What shall I do with you, O Ephraim? What shall I do with you, O Judah? Your love is like a morning cloud, like the dew that goes early away. Therefore I have hewn them by the prophets. I have slain them by the words of my mouth, and my judgment goes forth as the light. For I desire steadfast love and not sacrifice, the knowledge of God rather than burnt offerings. Here he points out their return to him is like the morning cloud. You ever seen that? You're out in the morning and there's this fog, and then the sun comes out and it's there just for a brief moment. It's so pretty, and then it's just gone. That's it. He says, that's your love for me. They come to God saying, oh yeah, let us know the Lord. Let us press on to know him, right? That's the major thing they're missing. But they don't really mean it, and they don't really endure in their studies. They say, oh yeah, I'm going to listen to everything that this prophet says. But the prophets cut them and hurt them and hurt their feelings. And then they say, I don't know, I don't want to do this anymore. I'll just offer a sacrifice, and then God will be pleased. God's not pleased with their sacrifices. He desires steadfast love and not sacrifice. Now, Jesus came in and said, I desire mercy and not sacrifice. And it's the same kind of idea that God desires faithfulness. Faithfulness to his word, faithfulness to his commands, faithfulness to the covenant that they are under, instead of love like a morning cloud. You go to chapter 7, in verses 14 through 16, he says, they cry out to me they do not cry out to me from the heart, but they wail upon their beds for grain and wine. They gash themselves. They rebel against me. Although I train and strengthen their arms, yet they devise evil against me. They return, but not upward. They're like a treacherous bow. Their princes shall fall by the sword because of the insolence of their tongue. This shall be their derision in the land of Egypt. Notice he says, they cry out to me, but not from the heart. They're crying out to me, saying, oh yes, we want to know the Lord and we want to serve him. Surely he will return to us and he will strengthen us. We will suffer for a few days, but God will surely be faithful as he's always been faithful, and he will lift us up. And God says, I know what's in your heart. You don't really desire me. What you desire is your grain and your wine. This is what you desire. And because you desire that, you're gashing yourself. You got the picture of, in the days of Elijah, those prophets cutting themselves because Baal won't answer them. Well, they're trying to get God to send rain, and he's not sending it. And now they're trying everything because they want their grain. They return to God, but they're not really returning to God. They return but not upward. They're devising evil. They're hoping to do more evil after God finally relents and sends the rain. They're planning it. And so God is not pleased with them. It's funny, in verse 2 of chapter 8 it says, to me they cry, my God, we, Israel, know you. And verse 3 says, Israel has spurned the good. The enemy shall pursue him. They made kings, but not through me. They set up princes, but I knew it not. With their silver and gold, they made idols for their own destruction. Notice how they say, they're crying out, we know you, God. We know you. We've studied now. We know all about you. We read through your word one whole time. We've got it all down now. And God says, you don't care anything about the good. You're just plotting evil continually. You're making kings for yourselves. You're putting your trust and your hope in political leaders and in idols, thinking that they will surely save you. God is not fooled by this. In verse 11, he says of chapter 8, because Ephraim has multiplied altars for sinning, they have become to him altars for sinning. They're building all these offers to offer their sin offerings so that God is forgiving them. And he said, they're just there so that you can keep sinning. It's kind of like the Catholic Church's offering of indulgences. You just pay this indulgence and then you can go and commit the sin. It's kind of the situation they've set up. And he says in verse 12, were I to write to him my laws by the 10,000s, they would be regarded as a strange thing. They don't really understand the law. They don't understand the purpose of the law. They don't understand what God really wants from them. They don't really know God. They offer all kinds of sacrifices, but it says God does not accept their sacrifices. God will instead remember their sins, and he will judge them for it. In chapter 9 and 10, it turns out that they are now mocking the prophets. They're mocking Hosea. Verse 7, the prophet is a fool. The man of the spirit is mad because of your great iniquity and your hatred. They're mocking God's prophets. And then he goes on to describe them as being as bad as the days of Gibeah. You remember in Judges when the man had his concubine and he came into Gibeah and they wanted to rape him, and they ended up raping her so much that she died. Gibeah, like Sodom and Gomorrah. Now he calls Israel like Gibeah in verse 9. And then in verse 10, he says, he reminds them of Baal Peor, which is in Moab, which is where Moab enticed Israel to go after all of those idols, and God lashed out against them for their sins. So he's saying, you're just as bad as those evil generations were before you. It's a cycle they've gone back around to doing again. Verse 1 of chapter 10, Israel is a luxuriant vine that yields its fruit. The more his fruit increased, the more altars he built. As his country improved, he improved his pillars. Their heart is false. Now they must bear their guilt. The Lord will break down their altars and destroy their pillars. Notice, they have become more and more wealthy. And the more wealthy they've become, the more evil they've decided to do. They just thought, well, I'll just offer more sin offering. Look at how many animals I have. Man, I can do a whole bunch of sin now. I can just offer all these sin offerings and I can go off and do whatever I want to do. The prosperity that they have was not good for them. Instead of helping them draw closer to God with thanksgiving, they became further from God. And God has said that they will reap what they sow. Chapter 10, verse 13, you've plowed iniquity, you have reaped injustice, you have eaten the fruit of lies because you have trusted in your own way and in the multitude of your warriors. They're just trusting in all these empty things. They're trusting in idols, they're trusting in political leaders, they're trusting in their warriors, they're trusting in their armies to protect them, to save them. And God is saying, you're going to reap what you sow. You want to sow iniquity, you're going to reap injustice. It's not going to be pretty in your society. Things are only going to get worse as a result of all this evil that you're pursuing. Then chapter 11 starts this next section. Finally, after all of this explanation of all their sin, we just kind of see how deep their sin is. And man, don't you see some resemblance to the things that we're facing today as God has revealed Israel's sin to them as they pursued wealth and empty things and turned away from God? Don't we see so much similarities between us and them? In Hosea chapter 11, we start this new section, and notice how it starts. When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. He's kind of reminiscing on these good days when he was a child. No, he's not talking about Israel being this unfaithful wife. He's talking about Israel being his child. I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. You might remember that verse from the New Testament. Now we kind of see its context. He's reminiscing about the faithfulness of Egypt, about his love for Egypt. But he says in verse 2, the more they were called, the more they went away. They kept sacrificing to the Baals and burning offerings to idols. Verse 7, my people are bent on turning away from me. And though they call out to the Most High, he shall not raise them up at all. This people is just so fixated on rebelling and worshiping idols and doing whatever they want to do that God says they're going to turn to me and cry to me, and they can do that all they want, but the whole time they're doing that, they're just planning to do more evil. And God says, they're going to find that I'm not going to help them at all. I'm going to let them suffer. Their sins are going to result in consequences, and they're going to reap what they sow. But verse 8 says something that's kind of odd. He says, how can I give you up, O Ephraim? How can I hand you over, O Israel? How can I make you like Admah? How can I treat you like Zeboim? These are cities of Sodom and Gomorrah that were destroyed along with Sodom and Gomorrah. My heart recoils within me. My compassion grows warm and tender. I will not execute my burning anger. I will not again destroy Ephraim. For I am God and not man, the Holy One in your midst. And I will not come in wrath. They shall go after the Lord. He will roar like a lion when he roars. His children shall come trembling from the west. They shall come trembling like birds from Egypt and like doves from the land of Assyria. And I will return them to their homes, declares the Lord. Ephraim has surrounded me with lies, and the house of Israel with deceit, but Judah still walks with God and is faithful to the Holy One. As he says that he says, how can I give them up? I hate this idea of giving them up, of selling them off into slavery. So he says, I'm recoiling within me. How can I do this? I will not utterly destroy my people. I will not destroy them after I've destroyed them. Instead, I will bring them back. And they will come trembling from their place of captivity, and they will come back to their homes and be restored. And he says in verse 12 that he's going to allow Judah to remain. So we kind of get the sense that the northern tribes of Ephraim, the northern tribes of Israel are all going to suffer this exile, but Judah will remain. Then we see, as you go into chapter 12 and chapter 13, that God is trying to help them understand their sin again, except this time he kind of points to the fact that these future generations are going to find help from God. He says, verse 6, so you, by the help of God, return. Hold fast to love and justice and wait continually for your God. He's actually talking to these exiled people and telling them, return and remember all of the mistakes that you made before. Verse 8, Ephraim has said, but I am rich. I have found wealth for myself, and all my labors, they cannot find in me iniquity or sin. Look what happened to them. They thought their riches meant that they were in God's favor. They thought that their riches meant that they were indestructible and that they were sinless because they had offered all these sacrifices to make up for their sins. And God says, remember these things. And remember, I am the Lord your God from the land of Egypt. I will again make you dwell in tents as in the day of the appointed feast. He says, I'm going to bring you back into the wilderness. I'm going to allure you. Remember how you were and all the judgments you received, and remember my promises to allure you, to speak tenderly to you, and bring you back into the tents. Verse 4 of chapter 13, he says, I am the Lord your God from the land of Egypt. You know no God but me, and besides me there is no Savior. It was I who knew you in the wilderness, in the land of drought. But when they had grazed, they became full. They were filled, and their heart was lifted up. Therefore, they forgot me. He reminds them, see this. He reminds them, I am your God, the only God you've ever known. I'm the one who brought you out of Egypt. But remember what they did. After they came out of Egypt, remember what Israel did and why I had to destroy them and send them off into exile. They enjoyed the blessings I gave them. Their heart was lifted up, and they forgot all about me. Don't fall into that trap again. He's trying to encourage his people not to get proud and boastful and think that they have everything that they'll ever need and look at their prosperity and forget God. He doesn't want that to happen again. In verse 14, he says, I shall ransom them from the power of Sheol. I shall redeem them from death. O death, where are your plagues? O Sheol, where is your sting? Notice the words sound very familiar. I'm going to redeem them. I'm going to ransom them. I'm going to bring them back from death and make them once again alive. In chapter 14, essentially the message is, if Israel will return to me, I will heal them. Verse 4, I will heal their apostasy. I will love them freely, for my anger has turned from them. And I will be like the dew to Israel. And this is what Jezreel was known for, is the dew. I will be like the dew to Israel. He shall blossom like the lily. He shall take root like the trees of Lebanon. His shoots shall spread out. His beauty be like the olive, and his fragrance like Lebanon. They shall return and dwell beneath my shadow. They shall flourish like the grain. They shall blossom like the vine. Their fame shall be like the wine of Lebanon. O Ephraim, what have I to do with idols? It is I who answer and look after you. I am like an evergreen cypress. From me comes your fruit. Whoever is wise, let him understand these things. Whoever is discerning, let him know them. For the ways of the Lord are right, and the upright walk in them, but transgressors stumble in them. Notice how he wraps up this whole book with kind of a choice, a decision that the people have to make. Are you going to come to me and find your healing and grow and flourish and be strong like a cedar in Lebanon and produce much fruit for my glory? Or are you going to go after those idols again? You see how he says, if you're wise, you're going to understand all these things that have happened to Israel, and you're going to make the right choice and walk in uprightness. And that ends the book. So what is the message of Hosea? Well, I think it's pretty clear as we've kind of walked through this that Israel is portrayed as this prostitute because of their idolatry. They get so wrapped up in their own prosperity, and they get so proud thinking that they are sinless and that they do all the right things and that they can trust in their riches and they can trust in their armies and they can trust in their political leaders, that they forget about God. Doesn't this sound familiar to us? I mean, yeah. This is our nation. This is what our nation seems to have done, right? I mean, we were one nation under God, 60 years ago, and now where are we? We're rich, we're indestructible, we've got this wonderful army, we've got all this prosperity, we've got everything, and so obviously we don't have any sin, we've never done anything wrong, and we're okay. But God is bringing about judgment on Israel for all of these very things, and that's scary. But the beautiful thing about Hosea is, and the message of Hosea is, that after this judgment that is against Israel, God will buy Israel back. He will fix what's wrong with them, and He will restore the relationship that has been broken because of their unfaithfulness. You just kind of look at that and take it in, and you're just kind of like, why in the world would God do that? Who in their right mind would do that? I mean, if we have a spouse who is unfaithful, like Gomer was unfaithful to Hosea, we'd be like, whew, I'm so glad that she made it obvious that she is so adulterous. I can get rid of this woman and get away from her. All she does is break my heart. All she does is ruin my life and make my life miserable. That's not the way God looks at it. If we were to buy Gomer back on the auction block, I imagine we would say, okay, now you're going to be my slave. And you're going to see what a slave life is really like. We might have a little vengeance here and there against her. But He takes Gomer back as His wife. And He says, I will be faithful to you, like I always was before. And you will be faithful to me. This is what God does for the sinful people in Israel who have committed adultery against Him time and time again. He says, I don't just want you to be my slave. I want you to be my wife. And I want to have a relationship where I am your husband and you are my wife. I am your husband, you are my wife, and we have this relationship, and we love each other, and you're faithful to me, and I'm faithful to you forever. You see in this that God's love is truly boundless. That He has this flood of mercy and compassion, that He's willing and able to forgive somebody of something that we might really struggle with. He's willing to just not only forgive them, but to just love them freely. I love how it says that in verse 4 of chapter 14. I will love them freely. He just opens up His heart and says, I'm gonna love you with everything I got. When you return to me, I'm going to heal you, and I'm going to open up myself to you and bless you as I always have. I'm going to lure you in, and then I'm going to give you your vineyards, and I'm going to speak tenderly to you and love you. I mean, those pictures of love are amazing in this book. So if we're going to apply the book of Hosea, I think it's really important for us to see something. As I look at different stories in the Old Testament, man, I struggle so many times to understand who am I in this story. I mean, I really struggle with that. And everybody's like, oh yeah, I mean, I'm Hosea. What are you talking about? This is simple. I'm obviously the prophet, and those people out there, that's sinful Israel. And those people are wrong, and they're doing all these horrible things against God, and they better repent, and God will love them and show them so much mercy. But man, they better become like me, and they better fix themselves. I do the same thing with David and Bathsheba, right? I say, man, I can't believe David did such a thing. All these blessings given to him. What a dummy. And I think I'm Nathan the prophet. I'm so wise. Look at my parable. I just think so much great things about myself. Is it possible that we are Israel? Is it possible that we're the ones who have been adulterous, who've rebelled against God constantly, who are completely undeserving of his steadfast love because of what we've done against him? That hurts. I don't want to think about that. I want to be Hosea again. I don't want to be Israel. But we have to see ourselves as Israel in order to find the redemption and the new relationship that God is offering to his people. We have to understand that we have been sold into slavery, into captivity because of our own sins, and that we need someone to buy us back and to show us that steadfast love, and that we need to learn from our mistakes, that we need to learn idolatry is spiritual adultery. We need to learn that riches are spiritual adultery if we just focus so much on them and think that in them is all of our hope, and that our political leaders are all of our hope. They're going to give us everything we could ever want, make our lives wonderful and protect us from everything. And we've got this great army and all these things. We have to repent of all that. And we have to seek the steadfast love of the Lord. We have to seek David, our king. We have to learn from our mistakes and don't say, I am rich and I have no sin. I've not done anything wrong. God's fine with me. Look at all these sin offerings that I've given to him. I've made up for everything I've ever done. No. We are horribly sinful in the eyes of a holy God. And we need his grace and mercy and compassion. We need his forgiveness. But the beauty of Hosea is the promise that we can receive that grace and mercy because of the death of his son, because of the ransom that is paid on our behalf. We can be his wife. We can receive all the blessings. He will love us freely, and we can grow and we can flourish. The choice is really up to us. As he says at the end of the book, the choice is yours. The choice is up to us. What are we going to do? Are we going to learn from this horrible mistake that Israel makes, that we are the horrible sinners and that we make these mistakes? And are we going to turn our hearts to God and seek to be faithful to him and to put away all the idols and to put away all the things that we pursue to give us satisfaction, to give us fulfillment? Are we going to turn ourselves to God and find his grace and mercy and his love to be everything that we need? The choice is yours. The choice is mine. What will we do? If you have any need this evening and we can help you in any way, please come as we stand and as we sing.